7 years, Amelia let Julian believe. He was the genius. She smiled at his parties, stood beside him in photos, and watched him take credit for ideas he never created. But while he was busy enjoying applause, she was quietly building a trap inside the very business world he worshipped. The divorce papers were supposed to erase her. Instead, they triggered an emergency board meeting, a hidden acquisition, and a legal war. Julian never saw coming. He thought he was removing a wife from his house. He didn't realize she was about to remove him from his empire.
Julian Vance grabbed his wife's arm, hissing as he shoved a thick folder into her hands. "Sign it," he ordered, his voice laced with menace. "You're just a placeholder here, Elara. You always were." His mother, Eleanor, watched from her armchair, a smug smirk playing on her lips. By the grand windows stood Chloe, barely 23 and 3 months pregnant, twisting a new engagement ring on her finger. And Julian, the venture capital wunderkind, who built his fund on his wife's family's technology, had no clue the woman he was casting aside owned the source code to his entire empire. If this is your first time here, you've stumbled into quite the storm. Make sure you subscribe, ring that notification bell, and stick around for the fallout. And comment your city below. I am curious to see how far this story of betrayal goes. Elara Thorne had spent a decade perfecting the art of being invisible. It wasn't because she was weak or scared or couldn't fight. No, she made herself small the way a volcano lies dormant, quietly gathering immense pressure, just waiting for the right moment to erupt and reshape the entire landscape. That rainy November morning, as the San Francisco fog swirled around their penthouse, Elara was at the epicenter of that eruption, and she didn't even blink. Julian had summoned her to the formal living room. That alone was a blaring red flag. Julian never used that room. For 10 years, he'd taken every meeting in his minimalist glass office, surrounded by panoramic city views and the kind of arrogance that consumes men who believe their own press. But this morning, he was standing by the fireplace in a tailored suit, his face a carefully constructed mask of regretful duty, and beside him, to Elara's right, was Eleanor Vance, Julian's mother, a woman who wielded emotional cruelty like a scalpel. Elara walked in wearing a simple silk blouse and slacks, her blonde hair tied back, her expression perfectly unreadable. She clocked the legal documents on the coffee table immediately. She saw the tiny twitch in Julian's eye when he noticed her looking, and she saw the faintest hint of a smile on Eleanor's face, the kind a person gets when they're about to enjoy a long-awaited victory. "Elara, have a seat," Julian instructed. She did. "My lawyers drew these up," he said, sliding the stack towards her. "The divorce. I want this handled by Friday." Elara didn't shed a tear. She didn't gasp or look shocked like some damsel in distress from an old movie. She looked from the documents directly into his eyes, and she asked, in a very soft voice, "Why?" Julian leaned back, an actor delivering a line he'd memorized. "Because this partnership has run its course. Because I need something more than this. Because, Elara, you have to realize that you and I were never actually partners." Eleanor made a small, triumphant sound, like a predator closing in on its prey. "Never partners," Elara repeated, her voice flat and hollow. "You were an exceptional hostess," Julian went on, and the way he said hostess dripped with condescension. "You managed the staff. You chaired the galas. You smiled for the cameras. But you never built anything real. You never created anything. You didn't bring a single tangible asset to this marriage that I couldn't just acquire myself." Elara held his gaze for a long moment. Something shifted in her eyes, not sadness, not anger, but something icier and far more dangerous. "Is there someone else?" she asked. The silence that followed was just a fraction of a second, too long to be believable. "That's not relevant," Julian finally said. "Her name is Chloe." Eleanor cut in, placing her teacup down with a sharp, pointed click. "She's 23, ambitious, and she's carrying Julian's son, which is precisely what this family needs to secure its legacy. Not a woman who's spent a decade coasting on my son's genius." Every single word was a deliberate jab. Elara felt them connect. She wasn't made of stone, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fall. She took one slow, deliberate breath and looked at Eleanor Vance with the kind of focus you get when you're no longer shocked by someone's capacity for cruelty. Pregnant, Elara stated, not as a question. 3 months, Eleanor confirmed, her smile tightening. So you see, Elara, this needs to be clean. The Vance name must be protected. Elara S. gaze drifted back to the papers. She saw the expensive fountain pen Julian had laid out. She saw the settlement amount on the first page. He was offering her $5 million for 10 years of her life. $5 million and an ironclad NDA to disappear forever. A raw, bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. Almost. She pressed them together and met Julian's eyes with a look he would replay in his mind for years, desperate to decipher it. "You're not going to fight this?" he asked. There was a weird hint of disappointment in his voice, as if he'd prepped for a war and felt robbed of his victory. "No," she said. "You're not even going to negotiate?" "No," Eleanor leaned in. "You should know Julian's attorneys are ruthless. If you challenge this..." I said no." Elara interrupted, and her voice was so calm, so utterly free of any tremor, that it forced Eleanor into silence. Elara pushed the pen aside. She laced her fingers together on the table. She looked at her husband, her soon-to-be ex, and said, "I'll sign them. But not today. I want 1 day." "Elara, 24 hours," she repeated, her voice now like ice. "I will sign your papers. I will take your $5 million, and I will walk away from this life. And you will never be bothered by me again. But I get 1 day." Julian glanced at his mother, who gave a small, impatient shrug. "Fine," he snapped. 24 hours. Elara stood, tucked her chair in, and left the room without saying another word. Behind her, she could hear Eleanor already celebrating how smoothly it all went. Elara didn't break her stride. She walked across the polished concrete floors, up the floating glass staircase, and into the master suite that had felt more like a showroom than a home for 10 years. She shut the door, and then, sitting on the edge of the bed, she gave herself exactly 3 minutes to feel the raw betrayal she'd suppressed downstairs. The pain was a physical thing, but it wasn't for Julian. She'd mourned the man she thought. She married months ago, the day she was accidentally copied on an email containing a pitch deck she knew he hadn't created. She grieved for their marriage in quiet moments since, all while playing the part of the flawless, supportive wife. The grief she felt now was for the woman who once believed this life was a fair trade for her own voice. That's who she mourned. Not the man, not the penthouse view, not the jewellery that always felt more like a retainer than a gift. 3 minutes. She gave herself exactly 3 minutes. Then she picked up a burner phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 10 years. The line connected before the first ring even finished. "Miss Thorne," a calm, familiar voice said on the other end, a voice that held a deep-seated respect she hadn't heard since her father died. "I was beginning to think I might never hear from you again." "Marcus," she said. Marcus Thorne had been her father's chief technology officer at Thorne Industries for 30 years. He'd worked for her father for 20, and for the last 10, he had been working for her in secret. His one directive was to stay in the shadows and ensure the Thorne name never publicly surfaced in relation to Julian Vance's ventures. He was 68, moved with the quiet precision of a master chess player, and his only tell was a slight tilt of his head that could mean either fascinating or catastrophic. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I will be," Elara replied. "I need you to call an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. tomorrow. It's already on the schedule." A brief silence hung in the air. "Will you be requiring the primary conference room?" Elara could picture it perfectly. She remembered the last time she was in that room. She remembered her father, at the head of the long table, telling her she had the most brilliant tech mind he'd ever encountered, that his legacy was her own, and that her only job was to protect it. She was 24. She had promised him she would, and now she was about to keep that promise. "Yes," she told Marcus. "Have the primary room ready." She ended the call. Then she opened a heavily encrypted file on her tablet and reviewed the documents she'd been refining for months. The final paperwork from Thorn Industries, finalising the hostile acquisition of Vance Capital, the one deal Julian never, ever saw coming. It was a pitch deck sent in a misdirected email outlining a 9-figure sale of a new AI algorithm. The entire valuation was based on a complex code base Julian was claiming his fund had developed over the last few years. Elara read the analysis again, slide by slide, slowly. The way you read something when you have to be absolutely sure you aren't making a mistake, when your entire future depends on it. She hadn't missed a single line of code. She set her tablet down and started to pack. She was quick, methodical. She ignored the diamonds, taking only a small data chip her father had given her years ago. She ignored the sculptures and museum-quality furniture she'd carefully selected for their penthouse, a perfect stage for a man who never noticed. She packed only her clothes, her papers, a few boxes of books, and a single, well-worn briefcase. Inside that case was the proof of who Eleanor Lockwood was, not Mrs. Julian Vance. It took the entire afternoon. As dusk fell, her bags were waiting by the service exit. She called a private car and messaged the manager of a discreet apartment she'd kept for years. Arthur confirmed the downtown apartment, held under a shell company tied to Lockwood Holdings, was ready. She went downstairs for one last dinner. She sat with Julian Ance, his mother, Catherine, acting as if nothing was wrong. She poured the Chardonnay. She politely answered Catherine S. questions about a gallery opening. She watched Julian eat, how he avoided her eyes, and studied his easy arrogance, his total blindness that he was dining with a woman who had already sealed his fate. Her face was a perfect, calm mask. After dinner, Julian excused himself to his study for a call. Eleanor heard his familiar, low laugh as she stacked the plates. She knew exactly who he was talking to. No proof needed. Catherine found her in the kitchen. "I do hope you understand," Catherine said, her voice a syrupy mix of pity and poison. "This is just how the world works. Julian needs a wife who can compete at his level." "You were always so lovely, Eleanor, but you lack the fire this city requires." Eleanor dried her hands slowly, staring at the woman who'd spent a decade chipping away at her confidence. A feeling of pure, cold clarity washed over her. "Thank you for the meal, Catherine," she said, simply. Catherine was stunned. That was not the reaction she'd wanted. She was expecting tears, a scene, something to confirm the weakness she'd worked so hard to nurture. She never imagined 3 polite words and a serene smile. "Well, Catherine sputtered. "Good night," Eleanor repeated. She went to her bedroom, confirmed the armoured car for the morning, and fell into a dreamless sleep. Eleanor was up before dawn. She showered, dressed, and moved her bags to the entryway herself. When the town car arrived, she carried her own luggage, waving off the driveress' offer to help. This wasn't about proving a point, it was about efficiency and a schedule timed to the minute. Julian appeared on the landing in a silk dressing gown, his hair a mess, and froze when he saw the suitcases. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked, a look of genuine confusion on his face. "I told you I needed some air," Eleanor replied smoothly. "And about the divorce papers, my attorney is sending them over this afternoon. All you need to do is sign." Julian just gaped at her, his usual smug mask shattered, replaced by something that looked an awful lot like panic. "Is that it?" he stammered. "That's it," Eleanor confirmed. "Eleanor," he said her name differently, with a fragile edge of desperation she had never heard from him. "Are you going to be okay?" She just looked at him. A decade with a man whose career she had built, who passed off her genius as his good fortune. "I'm going to be better than okay," she said. Then she picked up her last bag and walked out the door. Arthur was waiting for her at Lockwood Holdings at 9 a.m. sharp. He met her in the marble lobby, his face calm, as if he'd been expecting this for years. He led her to the private elevator, swiping his keycard for the executive floor as they ascended in comfortable silence. "The board has been called for an emergency session," Arthur said. "I told them it was about a time-sensitive investment strategy." "Perfect," Eleanor replied. "A few of the newer partners believe this meeting is to finalise the next funding round for Julian's company, Innovatech. Even better. Arthur gave her a small, proud smile she remembered from when she was a girl. It's good to have you back in charge, Miss Lockwood. Eleanor squared her shoulders as the elevator doors whispered open. She stepped into the quiet, electric hum of the top floor. Time to get started, she said. The boardroom had floor-to-ceiling glass, Chicago laid out below her like a kingdom to be reclaimed. 10 board members sat around the table as Eleanor walked in. She knew every face. Most knew her, but not like this. 2 of them, the main backers for Julianne S. next round, had never met her. They were completely unprepared. Eleanor went to the head of the table, set down her portfolio, and without a smile or a handshake, simply took command of the space. My name is Eleanor Lockwood, she began. I am the majority owner and, as of this morning, acting CEO of Lockwood Holdings. For the last 10 years, I have been on a personal sabbatical. That sabbatical is now over. The silence that fell was thick enough to cut. At last, one of the venture capitalists, a man named Davies, cleared his throat. My apologies, he said. I thought this meeting was to greenlight the next round of financing for Innovatech. It is, Eleanor said. She displayed a document on the main screen. Then she fixed Davies with a look that was as cold as Lake Michigan in January. Tell me, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. What do you know about the core technology behind the Innovatech power cell? Davies glanced at his colleague, then back to Eleanor. It's Mr. Vance's own design, developed over the last 5 years. It's the entire basis of the no, Eleanor interrupted, her voice like cracking ice. It's not. And then she started. She laid out the entire deception with the cool, brutal precision of someone who had spent years documenting every lie while Julian was getting magazine covers for the design he stole from her graduate work. She was quietly archiving every original schematic, lab note, and prototype that proved it was all hers. Every patent that made Innovatech a $10 billion unicorn came from research that was undeniably hers. By the time Eleanor finished, Davies looked like he was about to be sick. The other board members were frozen, witnessing the execution of a tech giant. Arthur slid a tablet in front of her. She signed the resolution with her thumb. The funding for Innovatech is terminated, she announced, effective immediately. Our council is also filing a lawsuit for patent infringement and investor fraud. She paused for a beat. Are there any questions? There weren't. Eleanor turned and looked out the window at the city skyline. Somewhere down there, Julian Vance was in his corner office, admiring his awards, completely certain he had won. He was oblivious. He had built his entire empire on her stolen ideas. He mistook her support for submission. He'd offered her a beautiful cage and a quiet life, as if that could ever be enough. Eleanor saw her own reflection in the window. She was finally home. She studied the vast, sprawling city below. Then she turned back to the silent room. Now, let's get to work, she said. From the 50th floor, Chicago was a different city. Eleanor had almost forgotten that. Forgotten how the traffic becomes a silent river of light, how the chaos below becomes an orderly pattern. She stood at the window of her office, her father's old office, which she would now make her own. She gave herself exactly 1 minute of quiet satisfaction before the storm began. Arthur came in without knocking, a habit she'd always encouraged. Julian Vance's lawyers are already on the line, Arthur said, placing a file on her desk. They're trying to negotiate a settlement, asking for a meeting to discuss mutual interests. There are no mutual interests, Eleanor said, still looking out at the city. I made that clear in the filing. And their response, lead counsel said, and I'm quoting, that Mr. Vance has a deep personal connection to the technology, and it's a tragedy to see it dismantled. He also implied he wasn't sure if your legal position was, as he put it, fully committed. Eleanor finally turned from the window. He questioned my resolve? He did. She held Arthur's gaze for a long moment, set up a video conference with their entire legal team for 4 p.m., and get the forensic accountant started on Innovatech's books. A faint glimmer of victory crossed Arthur's face. Already underway, he said, then left her alone. Eleanor sat down. The huge leather chair felt unfamiliar, a reminder that her father had sat here for decades. It was a small detail that could throw you off. She wouldn't let it. She opened the file and got to work. The first file was a detailed forensic audit of Innovatech's expenses. Eleanor had commissioned it 6 months ago from a discreet firm that Lockwood Holdings kept on retainer. It was one of the many secret assets of the company that she had maintained during her absence, a weapon she'd been sharpening for years. Her pen glided across the page as she read. The numbers always tell a story. Julian Vance went from a minor player to a tech mogul almost overnight. His meteoric rise began just after their 5th wedding anniversary, with a company built on a revolutionary patent. That patent had almost made Innovatech a $100 billion company. Eleanor remembered seeing the final schematics in a press release. She stared at the screen, recognizing the power cell design she'd sketched on a notepad 3 years into their marriage. It was during that quiet summer she was pregnant with their son, while Julian was supposedly on a fundraising tour, a trip she later discovered included his new mistress. She didn't say a word. Not then. She just watched the world praise her husband for her mind, sat perfectly still, and chose to be patient. Not from weakness, but from the certainties that the best move is never the first one, and a woman in a hurry gives her enemy all the advantages. She had been patient for 1.5 years. Today was the day. By 9 a.m, her phone buzzed non-stop. 6 of the calls were from blocked numbers, which meant the story was ripping through Silicon Valley, the insular world of biotech startups and venture funds where Ethan Hayes had made his name. The world where the Monroe family name was old money, the kind of influence men like Ethan would kill for. Ava ignored every call. The 7th was her lawyer, Lena, patrona for eternity years, and one of the few people who knew exactly what Ava had planned. "It's live, love!" Lena said. "The story is breaking everywhere." "Of course it is." Stanton and Croft are already scrambling. He's in a total panic. He should be. Ava, Lena's tone shifted, losing the legal chill and becoming a friend's warning. "Ethan's lawyer just called me. They want to know if today's news will impact your divorce settlement." Ava stopped sketching on her tablet. "Tell me exactly what they said." "They said Mr. Hayes knows about certain claims regarding the core patent of his company's new platform, and he believes those claims are defamatory. They also said, and I'm quoting directly here, that if Miss Monroe plans to use these claims as leverage in the divorce, they'll fight the entire settlement, claiming bad faith." Ava let the line hang silent for a few heartbeats. "Bad faith," she echoed. "That's the phrase they chose." "He threatened me this morning, Lena, about the baby." Another pause, this time from Lena. When she replied, her voice was pure ice. "Was anyone else there?" "His mother was on speakerphone. She won't say a word against her son." "No," Ava agreed. "She won't." She resumed her work. "But the Nest camera in our living room might have a different opinion." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Tell me you have that footage." "The whole smart home system was a Monroe Industries pilot program," Ava said plainly, "and I've always been the primary user on the cloud account." Lena let out a sound that was half a gasp, half a laugh. "My God, Ava, you've been planning this for ages, haven't you?" "I've been ready," Ava corrected her. "It's not the same." She went to the window overlooking the bay. "File the motion. Coercive control and duress. Subpoena the cloud storage for the video. I want it filed before lunch. You got it." "Arthur, he's going to throw everything he has at you when he puts this together. I'm hoping he does. Are you set?" Ava looked out at the city. Somewhere in a sleek downtown high-rise, her husband was probably on a call, feeling powerful, with no idea the core of his startup had just been erased. Erased by the woman he'd threatened that morning, the same woman he'd offered $5 million to, calling it a head start for the baby. "I've been set for 1.5 years, she said, and ended the call. It was 9:52. She had 8 minutes. She called her head of PR, Mark. "Mark," she said, "I need a media plan by 5. Precise. A scalpel, not a sledgehammer." I want our story to land first. We have to control the narrative before he can spin it his way. Got it, Mark said. What's the one thing you want people to hear? Ava thought about how to distill years of lies, a stolen legacy, and the man who was the father of her child into a soundbite for Bloomberg. A promising start-up, she began, built its flagship product on stolen trade secrets. That theft has now been exposed, and their upcoming funding round has collapsed. The founder is the same man whose divorce from a Monroe Industries executive is underway. The message is that the Monroe name is secure, our company is strong, and the man who tried to steal from this family is facing consequences. She took a breath. Focus on the business ethics, not the divorce. The gossip will handle itself. And this executive, Mark asked gently, how do we refer to her? As Ava Monroe, she said, CEO of Monroe Industries, nothing more. She hung up. Ava stood there, and for one solitary moment she let the weight of it hit her, the crushing isolation of a woman who had to reclaim her own justice, silently, for years, because nobody was listening when the real theft happened. No one saw Ethan steal her father's research, and no one heard his family whisper for years that she'd be nothing without her husband. No one ever saw the real price of her marriage, not in the shouting matches, but in the slow, daily erosion of being told she wasn't quite good enough. She let it all settle, just for a second, for one deep, shaky breath. Then she turned from the window and focused. Robert Jennings entered the conference room at 1 p.m., with the face of a man who'd spent all morning practicing a speech he didn't believe anymore. He had a junior associate with him, a new guy named Ben from the venture capital arm, who looked like a man trying to seem confident when he knew, for a fact, his world was imploding. Mark led them into the glass-walled boardroom. Ava was waiting at the other end of the table, the investment prospectus for Nexus AI displayed on her screen. She didn't stand when they entered. Robert, she said, thanks for coming. He took a seat with the awkward ease of a man pretending he wasn't about to be fired. Ava, he began. The tiny tremor in his voice when he said her name confirmed everything she suspected about this meeting. I want to preface this by saying I'm still extremely bullish on the potential of this partnership for Monroe. How long has your team been vetting the clinical trial data for Project Nightingale? Ava asked, slicing right through his sentence. Robert blinked. About 4 months. And in those 4 months, did anyone on your team verify the original research notebooks? There was a long pause. We were working under the assumption that a simple yes or no, Robert. No, he finally admitted. Did anyone find it odd that the primary data sets were a decade old with almost no lab records, as if they'd been copied from another source? Did anyone, Ava asked again, her voice low and steady, in 4 months, think to ask where this research actually originated? The silence in the room felt thick enough to suffocate. No, Robert conceded. Ava tapped her screen, and an email thread filled the monitor. In March, you got a request from Ethan Hayes' office to waive this standard data provenance check claiming trade secrets. Your team signed off on it. She looked directly at Robert. Why? The blood was draining from his face. The funding round had a very tight schedule, and let me be clearer, Ava said. You signed off because Mr. Hayes implied he had a board member on his side, a contact who would torpedo the entire investment if you held things up. Is that close? The junior associate, Ben, looked like he was about to be physically ill. Robert glared at Ava. That is a very serious claim. It's a question, Ava replied. And I happen to have the chat logs. This time, the silence was the only answer needed. Ava stood. I'm not firing you today, Robert. I'm giving you an opportunity. I want a complete unedited report outlining every shortcut your department took, every warning sign you dismissed, and every time you felt pressured. I want it on my desk by morning. If it's the full story, we'll talk about your career here. If it's incomplete, or if I sense you've left anything out, our next chat will be with the company lawyers. She picked up her tablet. Am I being perfectly clear? Robert could only nod. Say it, please. I understand, he managed to say. Ava went to the door and stopped. She looked back at him. And Robert, the next time you forget who runs this firm, remember today." She walked out. Mark, her assistant, was waiting with her schedule and a water bottle. She took it without slowing. "How did it go?" he asked, keeping pace. "He'll talk," she said. "He's more terrified of the server logs than he is of me, which means he knows exactly what's on them." She drank some water. "What's next?" You have the 2:30 call with our attorneys about the Nexus AI suit. At 3, the finalised divorce papers are due to be sent to Ethan's lawyer, and at 3:30, Mark paused for just a beat, so out of character that Ava gave him her full attention. At 3:30, a package was delivered by messenger. It's on your desk. The return address is the Hayes family vineyard in Napa. "Eleanor," Mark said. "Ethan's mother." It wasn't a question. The script on the box matches her signature from our donor records. Ava's expression was unreadable. "I haven't opened it." Mark walked quickly into her office, placed her water down, and nodded toward the heavy, linen-wrapped box on her blotter. It was the kind of packaging that screamed old money. She sliced it open. Inside, on a single heavy card, was Eleanor Hayes's sharp, perfect handwriting. It said, "Ava, you think you've won a little victory. You've just declared war on a family with more power than you could ever imagine. Julian's influence runs deep in Chicago real estate. You have no idea what you're about to start. Think very carefully before you see this through to the end. Some battles, once you start them, can't be stopped. I'm offering you this one warning as a courtesy because I never took you for an idiot. Don't make me regret that." Charlotte read it twice. She set it on her desk, staring. Then she grabbed her phone and dialed Diana. "I need to add a filing to our petition," she said as soon as Diana answered. "What is it?" "Witness intimidation. I just got a charming little note from Julian's father. I'll have Marcus scan it and email it over." Diana's voice tightened with worry. "This note means they're terrified." "I know. And terrified men do reckless, dangerous things." "I know that too," Charlotte said. "Which is exactly why we're moving faster." She paused. "What's the absolute soonest we can file the injunction on the Aria Tower?" "With the paperwork ready, maybe Friday. Make it tomorrow morning, before our star witness gives his sworn statement." She picked up the card again, holding it by the corner. "I want Julian served before he ever hears from our insider. I want him to know these aren't two separate problems. They're one giant fire, and I'm the one holding the match." Diana was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was filled with something that sounded like pure awe. "You're not holding back at all, are you?" "He grabbed my arm in our kitchen this morning," Charlotte said, her voice completely flat. "And that was the last time anyone from that family ever lays a hand on anything that belongs to me." She hung up the phone. For the next hour, she walked the legal team through the architectural copyright case with a cool clarity that left the whole room stunned. She knew every blueprint. She knew every falsified permit. She knew exactly which of Julian's claims were lies and which documents would prove he was a fraud in court. She'd been building this case for 2 years, blueprint by blueprint, on a hidden server, in the middle of the night while Julian slept, creating a secret life he never dreamed she was capable of living. At 3:58 p.m, she sent an email to her personal address. The subject line was simple, "Done." Attached was a scanned copy of their signed divorce settlement. She had done it, signed before the 4 p.m. deadline. She'd even accepted the insultingly low offer. She had done everything she promised. What she hadn't told him about was everything else she had planned. At 4:47, her assistant, Chloe, a smart young woman with no ties to the Chicago elite, buzzed the intercom. "Miss Price," Chloe said, "there's a visitor for you in the lobby." Charlotte looked up. "Who is it?" Chloe hesitated, which was unusual for her. "He says his name is Julian Croft. He doesn't have an appointment. Security is with him. He says it's urgent. He's demanding to see you." Charlotte let a small, icy smile touch her lips. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell security to send him up. Conference room 3. And not to my office." Chloe signed off. Marcus appeared in her doorway almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting right outside, which, of course, he had been. "Is that wise?" he asked. "Probably not," Charlotte said, standing and smoothing her dress. "But I really want to see the look on his face. I'll come with you." Julian Croft looked like a man who woke up believing the world was his, only to spend the day watching it burn. He was pacing in the conference room, still wearing the expensive suit from his victory lunch. But the victory was gone. Now he just looked like a man who had finally realized he was no longer in charge. "Charlotte," he said, his voice raw. She sat across the long mahogany table from him. Marcus stood by the door. Charlotte didn't invite Julian to take a seat. "You killed the deal," Julian said. "I did. You can't." He stopped, trying to recover. "This is because of the divorce." "This," Charlotte said, "is because you submitted fraudulent architectural plans to an investment group you didn't know I control, seeking a valuation based on designs you stole directly from me." Julian's jaw went tight. "My team designed that tower." "The Aria Tower," Charlotte said, "was first documented in a formal proposal I can produce, dated, with signatures, from 6 years ago, 14 months before your company even existed." She looked at him without blinking. "Would you like me to continue?" He was silent. "You built your company on my designs," she said. "You built your reputation on my vision. You stood on stages and accepted awards for buildings that came from my mind, in my private sketchbooks, on servers that were running in this very building before I ever laid eyes on you." Her voice never rose. It didn't shake. It just continued, calm and clear and devastatingly precise. "And then you slid divorce papers across our kitchen table and told me I had never contributed anything of value to your life." Julian's face twisted. She watched him, grasping for his usual confidence, and saw it completely disappear. "I didn't know," he started, "about Wellington Holdings." "I had no idea you were." "I know you didn't know," Charlotte said. "That was my decision. I funded your company for 7 years because I believed I was funding us. I was mistaken." She stood up. "The injunction will be filed Thursday morning. I suggest you call your lawyer tonight." "Charlotte," his voice cracked on her name. "Just a little. Just enough. What we had years." "We had you telling me I was nothing," she said. "And we had me knowing you were wrong and not saying a single word." She walked to the door, her hand resting on the frame. "I think we both know which one of us truly understood our marriage." She left him standing there. She walked back down the hallway, into her office, and she shut the door. And she stood alone in the room that had been her father's and was now hers. She pressed both of her hands flat on the polished surface of the desk, and she just breathed. Because this is the thing that nobody ever tells you about being right, about being the one who saw it all coming, who planned for it, who made her move at the perfect time. It doesn't make it stop hurting. It doesn't lift the weight of 7 years off your shoulders in one afternoon. You can be right and winning and in total control of the entire situation and still feel, in the silence of a room, with the door shut, the unique pain of a woman who loved a man who never deserved her. She felt it. She let herself feel every bit of it. Then she squared her shoulders. She sat down. She opened the next file. There was still so much more to do. The injunction hit Julian Croft's inbox at 8:57 Thursday morning, 3 minutes before the witness's sworn affidavit was due to arrive on Charlotte's desk. She knew the exact moment it happened because her lawyer, Diana, called her while she was in the car on her way to Wellington Holdings. And Diana's voice had that specific tone of calm satisfaction that Charlotte had come to know over 9 years of working with her. "It's filed," Diana said. "The full injunction. Architectural theft, fraudulent misrepresentation, and we attached the original design files for all 3 towers. The Aria, the waterfront gateway, the parkside lofts, everything." A short pause. "Charlotte, the documentation is bulletproof. I've been a lawyer for 23 years and I have never seen a more open and shut case." "He thought I was just a socialite," Charlotte said. "He thought you were a developer's wife," Diana said, and the word hung between them with all the irony it was due. Charlotte watched the city slide past her window. What happens next? His lawyer will demand an emergency hearing to fight the injunction. They'll claim the designs were a joint effort during the marriage, and that any creative work you did is marital property, not your own intellectual property. Diana's voice became sharp, but the initial city filings predate your marriage by 14 months on 2 key properties. That argument collapses the second a judge sees the dates. And the Parkside Lofts? That one is tougher, designed during the marriage. But we have your private design files, your personal emails, and digital sketches with metadata timestamps, plus 2 contractors who saw you working on the concepts alone. Diana paused again. One of those contractors is Marcus. Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest. Marcus, who had known her since she was a girl running through these halls. Marcus, who kept her secrets for 7 years without ever asking why. Marcus is on board. He called me himself yesterday, Diana said. I wrote down what he said. I've been waiting for the right moment to be helpful, and this feels like it. Charlotte pressed her lips together, fighting back tears in the back of the car. Not at 9 in the morning. Tell him thank you for me, she said. Tell him yourself, Diana replied. He's already at the office. She was right. Marcus was standing in the lobby of Wellington Holdings, holding her daily schedule and a coffee, just like always. He met her eyes with that same quiet look of approval that had always been her strength. Good morning, Miss Vance, he said. Leo. She took the coffee, her gaze holding his for just a beat too long. Thank you. Of course, he replied, walking with her to her office. The whole thing started at 8:51 a.m. An alert from the corporate Amex. A charge for a boutique hotel she'd never heard of. It was a tiny crack in the foundation of her life, and she spent the next hour prying it open, her fingers flying across the keyboard. As it turned out, the foundation was hollow. The one charge led to flight manifests, hotel bookings, and a hidden credit card statement. It confirmed everything Isabel had quietly feared. The affair wasn't a moment of weakness, it was a secondary life, a series of calculated lies and secret trips. It was a betrayal so perfectly scheduled, it was almost impressive, designed to fit into the gaps when she was travelling for work. In the quiet moments, she was too tired to be suspicious, but her husband had gotten careless, and careless was enough. Isabel forwarded a summary to her lawyer, Clara, at 10:15 with one sentence. Add this to the discovery file. Then her phone lit up, an unsaved number with a local exchange. The back of her neck tingled a physical warning she'd learned to trust. She answered, Is this Isabel Vance? The voice was a woman's, young and unsteady, like someone who had rehearsed this moment only to find the reality of it terrifying. It is, Isabel said. A pause, then barely a whisper. This is Maya. The world kept humming around her. The quiet clicks of keyboards, distant phones ringing. Nothing had changed, yet Isabel's universe had just narrowed to a single, burning point. Maya? She said, her voice carefully controlled. I know I have no right to call you. I can't imagine what you must be thinking. The words rushed out, gaining speed, as if slowing down would mean stopping for good. But there are things you don't know. About Julian, about the baby, about the lies he's been telling, and you have to know. Not for my sake. It won't help me. But what he's doing is wrong, and you deserve the whole truth. Isabel set her pen down. She leaned back in her chair. She pictured this young woman, somewhere in Austin, carrying her husband's child. And she thought about how hard it is to feel any empathy for the person who helped destroy your world. She said, talk. And what Maya said next took 11 uninterrupted minutes. Isabel listened without a single word. Maya explained that the pregnancy was real 3 months along, just as she'd claimed. But the rest of the life Julian had sold her about the Vance family and Maya's place in it was a complete lie. From the inside, it was a very different story. Julian had spent their entire relationship insisting his marriage to Isabel was a business arrangement. He swore Isabel knew about them and didn't care, that a divorce was already in the works. He sold her that story so well that Maya built her entire future around it. believing she was stepping into a life that was already waiting for her. Then, 2 days ago, Julian called her. His usual calm was gone. Underneath it all, he sounded panicked. He told her to stay quiet. He said there were some business issues, and it was critical that Maya not talk to anyone, not reporters, not friends, and especially not anyone connected to Isabel Vance. He told her they wouldn't be discussing the baby publicly for a while. He never asked how I was, Maya said, her voice cracking. He didn't ask about our baby, he just called to tell me to shut up, and then he hung up. Isabel sat in perfect silence. Maya, she said, keeping her voice completely level, though it took an effort. Is there anything else? Yes, a short, sharp breath. 3 weeks ago, I found some documents in his briefcase. I wasn't snooping. I just needed a charger, but they were right there. I didn't understand most of it, but I took pictures because it felt wrong. They were about a company, Orion Holdings. There were huge money transfers, moving from Croft Ventures accounts to somewhere that wasn't on the official books. Isabel picked her pen back up. Her hand was rock steady. How large were they? The ones I saw were between 900,000 and 2.5 million. And how many were there? Maya snorted. The pages I saw had 6, but the paperwork listed a much longer series. The reference code started with transaction number 12. Isabel wrote it down. At least 12 transfers. At that amount, this was massive fraud. This was the kind of financial crime that goes way beyond a lawsuit and straight into federal jurisdiction. Can you send me those pictures? Isabel asked. That's why I'm calling. Maya replied. Isabel gave her a secure email that routed through her company's encrypted server. She heard the clicks of a phone as the images were attached and sent. Maya, Isabel said after the files arrived, you need to get a lawyer. Your own lawyer, not Julian's, and nobody tied to his family. I know, Maya whispered. I'm so sorry for my part in this. I know that doesn't change a thing. Isabel considered what to say. She could be gracious and accept the apology, play the part of the bigger person. Or she could be honest, and the truth was, forgiveness wasn't something she could just pull out of a hat on a Tuesday morning, not 10 minutes after learning this woman was pregnant by her husband. She found a middle ground, because that's where reality usually lives. Take care of yourself, she told her, and take care of your baby. Then she hung up. She sat for a moment, the phone still in her hand, the sheer scale of it all sinking in. Orion Holdings, 12 transfers. The name stared back at her from her notepad like a door she was about to open, knowing she could never shut it again. Her first call was to Leo in Communications. I need you to find everything on a company called Orion Holdings, she said. Just publicly available information for now. Corporate records, who's on the board, any known business ties with Croft Ventures. I need it within the hour. On it, Leo said. Her next call was to Clara. Are you sitting down? Isabel asked. I'm never sitting down. Clara shot back. What is it? So Isabel told her everything, about the call with Maya, about the photos now in her secure inbox, and about the numbers, the transfers, the sequence, and what it all meant. Clara was quiet for so long Isabel had to check if the call had dropped. Clara, I'm here, Clara finally said. I'm just another pause. Isabel, if these numbers are real, and this is back as far as it looks, this isn't a civil suit anymore. We're talking wire fraud on a scale that will bring in the SEC, maybe even federal, prosecutors. I know. This is much bigger than the divorce, bigger than the lawsuit over his firm. I know that too. Do you want to go straight to the authorities, or do you want to... I want to see the photos first, Isabel cut in. I want our forensic accountants to verify everything before we make a move we can't take back. She paused. But Isabel, if this is what it looks like, Clara said quietly, Julian Croft is going to prison. Isabel put down her pen. In all her careful planning, through the months of building her case and waiting for the right moment to act, she had never let herself think that far ahead. She'd focused on the company, the intellectual property, on taking back what was rightfully hers. She had thought about Julian's reputation, the Croft family name, his mother's condescending attitude, and the smirk on his face when he'd tried to threaten her. She'd thought about all of it, but she had never once let herself think about prison, because prison meant this was so much bigger than a personal betrayal, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be responsible for that. But now, she was. "Call me when you've seen the photos," she told Clara. She opened her email, and there they were. 12 images, a bit blurry on the edges as phone pictures often are, but the details were perfectly clear. She forwarded them to their forensic accountants with an urgent flag. Then she sent a copy to Clara. Finally, she printed a set, placed them in a folder, and locked it in her desk. At 12:30, Leo sent his report on Orion Holdings. It was a shell company registered in Nevada 2 years ago. The owner was a man named David Chen, a 52-year-old wealth manager who also consulted for Croft Ventures about 26 months back. The company had no actual operations, no website, and no address besides a mail forwarding service. It was a classic ghost corporation, designed for one reason, to hide money and kill a paper trail. Isabel read the entire report twice before placing it in the locked drawer. Just then, Nina knocked and entered. "Miss Vance," she started. "There are 2 reporters in the lobby, no appointment. They're from the Tech Chronicle. They claim to have a tip about the Croft Ventures funding deal and want to comment." Isabel looked at the clock on her wall. It was 12:47. The lawsuit was filed less than 4 hours ago. "How do they already have it?" Eleanor asked. "Someone tipped them off," David replied, mentally scanning the short list of suspects. It wasn't his people. They were airtight. Not Isabel, not her partners. That left the Crofts. Either someone Julian's legal team cracked and leaked to the press, or more likely, Sophia Rossi tried to control the narrative herself and completely blew it. "Tell them I'm in back-to-back meetings," Eleanor instructed, "and that Vance Innovations will issue a formal response by end of day tomorrow. All inquiries go through comms," she added. "And David! Make sure Ben knows they're in the lobby." Ben nodded, then slipped out of the office. Eleanor got up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, the media. She knew this was coming. She'd even told David to prep for it, but the speed was all wrong. This meant she was already losing control of the story, which meant the next 24 hours would set the public tone, and that tone would determine how much of her company would survive the fallout. She called David's cell. "The San Francisco Chronicle is downstairs," she said. "I know," he answered. "They hit my direct line 20 minutes ago, and I just got a heads up from a source at TechCrunch. They've got the exact same file. And the leak? No idea yet. But the story they're running with is a choice." His voice was tight. "They're positioning this as a hit job from a jealous, pregnant wife. They literally used the phrase personal vendetta." Eleanor knew instantly. Sophia. This had her signature all over it. The calculated spin, playing the innocent victim, painting Julian as a good man trapped by a vengeful pregnant spouse instead of a cheat caught in a web of his own lies. It was clever. It was exactly the kind of move that could muddy the waters and make people doubt her motives. "Scrap the media plan," Eleanor said. "I want the real story leaked to the Journal by 9 a.m., not a statement tomorrow. And David, you're going to include screenshots of his messages. Not the financial records, not yet, just the texts. Let his own words do the talking," she added. "What about the pregnancy? How are we positioning that?" Eleanor paused. The baby was her greatest weakness, but also her most powerful asset. Handled correctly, it gave the story a deeply human anchor. Handled poorly, it made her look like she was driven by hormonal rage, which was demeaning, and precisely what Sophia wanted. "The pregnancy is mentioned only to frame the depth of his betrayal," she said evenly, "not as my reason for acting. I'm not a scorned wife. I am a co-founder whose trust was systematically violated. Those are the facts. That is our narrative." "Understood," David said. At 2:15, her lawyer Isabel called. "The investigator authenticated 7 of the 15 wire transfers," she said. "Eleanor, they're real. The dates are confirmed. The hotel bookings are real too. All the expenses trace back to a credit card, Julian opened last year under a shell company we found in his private office files. There was a brief silence. The PI wants access to all of it, not just the statements you found. The original investment portfolios, if you can access them. I'll get my asset manager on the phone right now, Eleanor said. There's something else, Isabel said, her voice shifting to the low, careful tone she saved for legitimately bad news. Our forensic accountant recognized the name of that shell company, Apex Holdings. He's seen it before, not with Julian, but on a divorce case he handled about 5 years ago. He said that corporate structure is designed for one single purpose, to illegally hide marital assets. The silence that followed felt like it sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The husband in that case served 18 months in federal prison for fraud. Eleanor stood completely still. 18 months, she repeated, almost a whisper. The situations were different. It was much less money. Julian's deception, if these files are what we suspect, is far more elaborate. His potential criminal exposure could be significantly worse. Eleanor slowly sank into her chair. She felt the cool glass of her desk, thinking about the man she had married. Not the man she was in the process of divorcing. Not the arrogant, dismissive man who offered her $500,000 to simply disappear. She thought about the man she agreed to marry 7 years ago, on a day that felt like her entire life was just beginning. She thought about the man she believed he was. Isabel, she said, no matter what happens, I need you to promise me something. Make sure that when this is finished, the story people tell is the real one, not the version Sophia is peddling, and not the one where I'm the villain, and Julian is the poor, trapped husband. Her voice was like ice. The true one? Where a woman spent years building an empire while the man she loved was secretly building a way to take it all away. That story. That is the story that needs to be told. Isabel was quiet for a moment. It will be, she finally said. I give you my word. Eleanor ended the call. She opened a secure drive on her laptop and looked at the files neatly arranged inside. The wire transfers, the Apex Holdings analysis, the investigator's 30-page report, the threatening messages from Sophia. She stared at the entire collection of lies and proof and consequences and thought about how long she had been carrying this awful secret all by herself. Not all by myself, she corrected aloud. Her brother, Isabel, and the few close friends Julian had never managed to charm because they'd always sensed something she had refused to see. They knew. She closed the file. At that exact moment, her assistant's voice came through the intercom. Mrs. Vance, I have Mr. Croft on line 1. He's insisting it's urgent that he speaks with you, he said. Ben paused, and in that tiny gap, Eleanor heard not just professionalism, but real hesitation. He said if you don't take his call right now, he's going to post a tell-all video online at 4 o'clock. Eleanor glanced at the time. 2:23. 1 hour and 37 minutes. She almost laughed, not because it was amusing, but because she recognized the strategy. This was a man realizing his threats were empty, so now he was trying to shatter the whole game board. It was pure panic, and panicked people, as Eleanor knew all too well, almost always end up destroying themselves. I'll take it, she said. She lifted the receiver. Julian, she said, stop this now. His voice was nothing like it was yesterday. The smooth, easy charm was gone, replaced by something raw and desperate. Stop the lawyers. Stop leaking things to the papers. Just call it all off, and I will give you whatever you want. Double the last offer, triple it. Just give me a number. You can't afford to triple it, Eleanor said flatly. Not any longer. A dead silence stretched across the line. Then, what the hell is that supposed to mean? It means the question of what you can afford is something your new criminal defense attorney will be explaining to you shortly. I'd recommend you listen to him, not me. Post your video, Julian. Say anything you like. But you need to understand something very clearly. She paused, letting the silence do the work. Every single allegation you make from this moment on becomes part of the public record. Every lie can be disproven, documented, and then used against you in court. Another beat, Are you absolutely certain you want to testify against yourself? The silence on his end was the longest one yet. I could have been a better husband, he finally said, his voice so quiet she could hardly hear it. I know that. I know I made some terrible mistakes. Julian, she cut in. What? Don't. She hung up the phone. She sat there holding the receiver for a full minute. Then she set it down and called David for the third time that afternoon. Move the timeline up. I want the story live by 8 a.m. tomorrow, she said, and add a final statement from me at the bottom. I'll give it to you now. Go ahead, I'm ready, David said. My client is confident that the evidence will fully substantiate her claims and that the truth will ultimately speak for itself. We believe in the integrity of the facts and welcome a thorough and transparent review. She could hear the rapid clicking of his keyboard. That's it, she said, not one word more. After ending the call, she sat in her silent, empty office for 3 full minutes, not to grieve, not to reconsider, but just to acknowledge that the machine she just switched on could never be turned off, and that she'd done it knowing the entire cost, and she had absolutely no regrets, none. Julian was scheduled for a deposition at 4 o'clock. Eleanor learned he wouldn't be there at 3:58 when her lawyer sent a text message that simply read, "He's a no-show. No appearance, no reason given." His lawyer just vaguely cited a sudden family emergency. She read the text, put her phone face down on the desk, and turned back to her work. She wasn't surprised. A man who folds during a private phone call doesn't magically grow a spine for a sworn public testimony. What she felt wasn't relief, not exactly. It was the quiet satisfaction of predicting a fatal flaw perfectly, of knowing your adversary so completely you could name the exact moment his nerve would break. Elena had known Julian Croft for a decade. 10 years of seeing how he handled pressure, how he projected confidence when he felt insecure, and how he used anger to mask his fear. She'd learned his tells, not by choice, but through simple proximity, day in and day out, until you know someone's patterns better than they do. It wasn't a gift. It was just the cost of a decade of paying attention. At 4:15, her lawyer, Maya, knocked and came in. The auditors finished their initial pass on the financials, she said. They need to meet tonight. They said the problem is, and I'm quoting, exponentially worse than our initial assessment. Elena looked up. How much worse? Her lawyer paused, which was unlike her. That silence spoke volumes. They believe the Innovate Fund was just a front. It's a hub for a whole network. Multiple shell companies, offshore accounts. She hesitated again. They also found evidence he faked user growth metrics for the last 2 rounds of VC funding. Elena set her stylus down. Julian was raising millions based on a user base that didn't exist. That's what the data suggests. Yes, she was quiet for a long time. She absorbed the scale of it, a man who hadn't just stolen her code. He'd constructed a massive house of cards on the reputation her software gave the company. He raised millions against a valuation built on her architecture and funneled it where? She didn't know yet, but she would soon. Set the meeting for 7, she said. My office, and Maya will be here. Martin nodded and left. Elena went to the window. Below? San Francisco began its evening shift, a view she'd known since she was a teenager, interning in this very building. She'd loved this place back then. The energy of being part of something important, something real, where people were building things to last. She once believed she was doing that with Julian, creating something permanent. The thought surfaced and passed without shattering her. That was new. The memories could come, but they no longer had power. Her phone vibrated. A message from Leah. Sophia Croft keeps trying to get through to you. She's called the front desk 4 times in the last hour. Should I keep blocking her calls? Elena typed back, yes. Log every attempt the time, the number she's using. Send the log to Maya. Then she worked until 7. The meeting that night took nearly 3 hours. The forensic data team presented what they'd found. Their lead was David Chen, a man who had testified in 3 major SEC fraud cases. His name alone made CEOs sweat. They laid out the facts with chilling clarity. The Innovate Fund transfers were real, 14 of them, over 22 months, totaling $31.4 million. The money moved from Apex Innovations' venture capital injections through the Innovate Fund and into two other shell corporations, one in Singapore, another in Panama. It ultimately landed in a private account that Chen's team traced, with near certainty, back to a holding company Julian Croft controlled. That was just the beginning. The second piece was the user data fraud. For 4 years, Apex had submitted doctored user engagement reports to 3 different VC firms to secure new funding rounds. The reports were verified by an outside consultant, a man named Leo Vance, who also happened to be on the Innovate Fund's paperwork. The user metrics were inflated, in David Chen's expert opinion, by 60 to 80% in key quarterly reports. This was done to trigger funding milestones the company's real growth could never have hit. The total fraudulent funding secured was around $18 million. Maya sat opposite Elena, her notepad covered in ink. By the time Chen finished, it was almost full. "The total exposure," Maya said, her eyes on her notes. "Wire fraud? Securities fraud? IP theft? This is federal territory. Are we looking at a RICO situation?" David Chen considered it. Potentially. The third-party involvement could frame it as a continuing criminal enterprise. That's a question for the US attorney, not a data analyst. But the pattern is there. Elena had been quiet for over an hour. Now she spoke. "How long?" she asked. David Chen met her gaze. "The first offshore transfer we've confirmed was 26 months ago, but the doctored metrics began 4 years ago, right as Apex Innovations started getting major tech press." He paused. "That buzzed the awards?" The glowing articles, the acquisition interest from Viridian Dynex, that's what made the fraud work. Without that sterling reputation, no VC would have signed those checks. The room went dead quiet. Elena looked at Maya. "And that reputation was built on my stolen code," Maya said, stating the fact to make it concrete. "Yes," Elena said quietly, "it was." David Chen looked from one to the other. "Miss Serrano, I have to ask this directly. Your answer here is critical for our next steps." He waited for her nod. "Were you ever aware, during your marriage, that any of these financial dealings were taking place?" "No," Elena said. "I knew he stole my work. I never knew about the money, and the company's financials. Did you have access or approval rights?" "Nah. My name isn't on any of Apex Innovations' corporate papers." David Chen nodded, jotting it down. "I'm asking because your total financial separation from him is what will shield you. It means when the feds start digging, and Miss Singh, I presume you'll be placing that call." "First thing in the morning," Maya confirmed. "Then Miss Serrano's position as the victim of the IP theft, along with her financial distance from the company, frames her as a cooperating witness, not a target of the investigation." David paused. "That distinction is everything. It needs to be established in the very first phone call." Elena let that land. She looked at the screen, at the charts and spreadsheets, the cold, hard math of what Julian had built on the back of her code. She felt a mix of rage and loss, that feeling when you finally grasp the true size of a catastrophe you were too close to see. "He used my code," she said, "to build the reputation he needed to defraud investors." The room was silent. The meeting ended at 9:42. David Chen and his team packed their laptops, moving with the quiet purpose of people handling evidence. Maya stayed. She and Elena sat opposite each other in the silent boardroom. For a full minute, neither said a word. "How are you holding up?" Maya finally asked. It was a genuine question from the woman who'd been Elena's lawyer for a decade, who had just seen her absorb a life-altering bombshell without breaking. Elena considered the question. "I feel like I thought my house was on fire, but someone just told me it's actually the whole neighborhood," she said. "And the fire started years ago. I'm just now seeing the smoke." Maya nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "I need Julian to know before morning that this is much bigger than a civil suit. I want him to have tonight to understand the full scope of what he's facing." Elena met her gaze. "Not to give him a chance to run. I want him to know that I see everything, all of it. I want him to spend the night with that. Maya was quiet for a second. I can have his attorney notified of our findings tonight, professionally, in a way that makes it clear federal involvement is coming. Do it, Elena said. Maya left. Martin appeared, as he always did, exactly when he was needed. He handed Elena her coat and her briefcase and rode the elevator down with her. Martin, she said as they descended, did you know? When I was married to him, did you ever suspect any of this financial mess? Martin was quiet for a few floors, and his silence was the answer. I suspected, he said, choosing his words, that Mr. Croft was not the man he presented himself to be. I had no specific proof. He paused. I also made a conscious choice not to seek out information you had not requested. I have second-guessed that choice. Elena looked at him. Don't, she said. You respected my boundaries even when I was mistaken. There is nothing to regret about that. Martin's expression softened, a rare sight that looked like a profound shift. You have your father's integrity, he said, in every way that counts. The elevator doors opened. Elena crossed the lobby and stepped into the cool San Francisco night. She stood on the pavement for a moment, letting the city's energy wash over her, the noise, the lights, the sheer indifference to her personal crisis. She took a deep breath. She went home. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. And the next morning she was at her desk by 7:15, and the official statement from Serrano Labs went live at 8 o'clock sharp. By 8:30 that morning, her phone was buzzing non-stop, a clear sign her industry-wide memo had landed. At 8:51, her lawyer, Nina, called. Archdigest is leading with it, she said. They've completely buried the affair. Their headline reads, Star architect Clara Hayes locks husband out of firm over stolen blueprints. There was a short pause, and Clara could almost hear the satisfaction in Nina's voice. Clara, this is huge. Every design journal has picked it up. The internet as well. It's on fire. And the sentiment? She asked. Almost 100% on your side, Nina confirmed. The pregnancy, the stolen designs, the very public betrayal. People get it. The story cuts deeper than the usual industry gossip. After a beat, Nina added, Sophie's PR team released a statement an hour ago, calling this a smear campaign from a jealous wife. It's gaining no traction at all. Clara let a small, sharp sliver of victory in, just one. Make sure our people are only monitoring, not responding. We don't have to argue with her. The facts will do it for us. Already done, Nina said. At 9:17, Nina was back on the line. Marcus' lawyer called me just after dawn, she said, a full 2 hours before we even sent the memo. His voice and Nina's voice was a mix of professional pride and total shock. He was asking for surrender terms. Clara carefully placed her mug on the table. Terms. A complete return of all proprietary blueprints and structural models, transfer of the patent for your new concrete composite back to you, and the total dissolution of that shell corporation he set up, plus full compliance with our financial audit. Nina paused, and he made one personal request, which his attorney repeated exactly. What was it? He wants to speak with you. Just a single meeting, face to face, before we officially file any criminal charges. Clara stared into the dark screen of her laptop at the faint shape of her own face. Why? His lawyer was vague. But I think he needs to tell you something. He's unwilling to put in an email. Clara considered it. She thought about what Nina had told her last night, that trapped men do desperate things, and she wondered why Marcus would insist on seeing her instead of just hiding behind his lawyers. And she remembered the frayed sound of his voice on the voicemail from yesterday, when he'd just said, I destroyed us, and she had deleted it instantly. Tell his lawyer the meeting is a go for 11 a.m. today, she said. Here, in my design studio, David will be in the room. The entire discussion will be recorded, with Marcus' full knowledge and consent. If he agrees to that, I'll see him. Nina passed it on. The reply came in under 5 minutes. He S in. At 10:45, David S' voice came over the intercom. He's here, David said. 15 minutes early, Clara noted. Yes, David confirmed. He's been sitting in the lobby for the last 12 minutes. Clara looked up from her concept sketches. What's his demeanour? David weighed the question with his usual gravity. He looks like a man who hasn't slept in days, he said, and like a man who has made a final, difficult decision. She gave a small, sharp nod. Give me 5 minutes, then send him in. She used that time to do something she'd been putting off for 2 days. She unlocked a drawer and took out an ultrasound picture. It was small. In a plain folder, a blurry image of the new life they had been planning together. She had been happy that day. She could admit that now with perfect, painful clarity. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. She looked at the image for maybe 30 seconds. She saw it for what it was. Not leverage, not a memory. Just a picture of a hope that was real before it became something else. Then she slid it back into its folder and shut the drawer. When Marcus walked into the conference room, Clara was already seated at the head of the table. David stood by the door. A small digital recorder sat between them, its red light blinking with a steady, silent rhythm. Marcus sat down. He looked precisely as David had described. Empty of sleep, and empty of the easy confidence that was usually his greatest weapon. He looked, Clara thought with a feeling she refused to call pity, like himself. Like the actual man who lived beneath the polished performance he gave the world. "I'm not going to insult you with apologies," he began. "I know they're worthless to you now." "They are," Clara said, her voice flat. "I need to tell you something the lawyers don't know." He put his hands flat on the polished table. "The entire plan to sell your blueprints to Titan Construction. It wasn't my idea. It was your brother's." The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. Clara's expression was a perfect blank, but inside, everything went quiet, like the moment before a building collapses. "Leo," she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "He approached me 6 months ago. He gave me everything I needed to get past your firm's digital security, to know which projects were the most valuable." Marcus S. jaw was clenched. "I never asked him why he hated you so much. I didn't care. All I saw was the money." He paused, looking down at his own hands, but the information was too specific, too personal. He knew things that only family would know. "Someone inside your life was using me to completely destroy you." Clara flicked a glance at David. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, telling her he knew this wasn't about business anymore. "About 3 weeks ago, when I realized this whole scheme could implode, he told me he had an insurance policy, a way to make sure I stayed silent. He said if I ever considered turning on him, he would ruin you right alongside me." Marcus finally looked up, his eyes hollow. "I think that's why he isn't worried about an audit. He thinks he has you trapped." Clara kept her breathing perfectly even. Her face was calm, but inside, her entire legal strategy had just been blown apart by a betrayal she had never imagined. "Does Leo know that you're here, right now?" she asked. "No. Does your own lawyer know you're telling me this?" "No, Marcus." She leaned forward. "If you're being honest, you've just confessed to a conspiracy 1,000 times worse than corporate theft. Do you understand what you just did?" "Yes," he said. "Why?" He met her gaze for a long moment, and in the quiet before he spoke, Clara saw something raw and defenseless in his expression. Not regret, not love, not even simple guilt. It was the look of a man who had finally exhausted the energy it took to be a fraud. "Because you were right," he said, "about all of it. And because whatever happens to me, I refuse to let the thing that ruins you be something I had the power to stop." Clara absorbed that for a moment. She looked at the man who had hurt her beyond measure, who had stolen her life's work, who was the father of her child. She saw the entire ugly disaster for what it was, and she made her choice. "David," she said, "get Nina on a secure video line and get our head of data security." She rose to her feet. "We need to expand the scope of this audit immediately." She turned to Marcus. "You will stay here. Don't call anyone. Don't contact Leo. And do not contact your attorney until Nina has spoken to him first." She paused. "If what you told me is the truth, and if we can prove it, your legal standing will change. Not completely, but significantly." Marcus just gave a slight nod, silent. She walked towards the door. Then she stopped, because one more thing needed to be said, and if she didn't say it now, it would stay lodged inside her forever. "The designs," she said, without turning to look at him. The Solaris Tower, the kinetic glass, the self-healing concrete formula, all of it. She took a breath to steady herself. I created that work because I loved the art of it, not to build a brand or beat a competitor. I made them because they are the truest part of who I am. She turned then, just enough for him to see her hand resting instinctively over her stomach. You and my brother took that from me. You twisted it into something cheap, something dirty, all for a quick payout. She let the words hang in the silence. I need you to understand that. Not as a final insult, but as a fact I need you to live with. Then she walked out. In the hallway, she pressed her back against the cool concrete wall for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds to let her body register the shock her face wouldn't show. Then she straightened, took out her phone, and called Nina. Because her own brother had tried to burn her world down, and Clara Hayes had no intention of letting him get away with it. She didn't even have to think. The name was already there in Clara's mind before Ava finished her second sentence. It was nearly noon, the day after Marcus's confession, and Clara was at her desk, with Nina on speaker and Ava's initial security findings on her monitor. Ava was detailing the precise data from Hayes architecture that had been passed to Leo, CAD blueprints, load-bearing models, materials supplier credentials, the single specific weakness in their new project management system. And while Ava spoke, Clara was mentally mapping the network of who had access to all of those things at once, who could possibly have known every one of those crucial details. And the answer wasn't a theory she was forming, but a truth she had always known but refused to see. The name came out like a sigh. Robert Vance. The line went dead quiet. Then Nina's voice, sharp with warning. What makes you so certain? The padded invoices, the offshore accounts, the property records. Clara was on her feet now, looking out at the Miami skyline. All that money moved through the acquisitions division. Robert ran that entire division for 2 years. He approved every single budget. He was the one who got that first quiet warning from the auditors and made it disappear. She began to pace. When I confronted him in that meeting, he didn't even blink. He just owned it. He handed me a complete audit of the server logs, 100 pages, perfect in every way except one. It didn't mention David. Didn't mention Apex Dynamics. It said nothing about where the seed money for the shell company came from. She paused. An innocent man doesn't just forget to include the part that proves his guilt. Sarah's voice came through the speakerphone. If Marcus was feeding David the code, that audit is a smokescreen. He gave it to you the morning after Apex announced their new platform. He knew this was coming. That document isn't a confession, it's his alibi. Amelia looked over at Leo, who was now standing in her doorway, his face tense, like someone watching a server crash in slow motion. "Leo," she said, "how long have you suspected Marcus?" He paused a half-second too long. "A year," he admitted. "And you said nothing?" "You weren't CEO yet," he replied, his tone direct, not an excuse. "I had a gut feeling, but no concrete proof. Bringing a hunch about your CTO to the founder's wife, who was never in the building, would have been career suicide. It would have crippled your authority before you even started." He let that hang in the air. "I made a choice. It wasn't the right one." Amelia held his gaze, understanding his logic but not ready to forgive it. Leo saw it in her eyes and accepted it. He offered no more excuses, which was the only thing she respected right now. "We'll sort that out later," she said. "What's our play?" Sarah's voice cut through the phone, sharp and clear, exactly what Amelia needed. "We take everything to the FBI today. The Apex Dynamics paperwork, David's confession from yesterday's call, and all the data Leo's team has on the offshore accounts. We absolutely cannot confront Marcus. We can't let him know we've connected him to David. We let the federal agents handle it. If we show our hand," Sarah warned, "he could wipe the entire network clean. He knows where every single compromised file is." "Agreed," Amelia said. "Sarah, make the call." She waited a moment. "And Sarah, do it right now. I want this moving before Marcus even realizes the game has changed." The call ended. Amelia stood by her window, that view, her office, and she finally felt the crushing weight of the last 3 days. She had walked out of her marriage with just one carry-on bag and a secret she hadn't even told her own attorney. She'd walked into this high-rise and seized control of her family's 30-year-old software empire. She had killed a disastrous merger, filed a massive intellectual property lawsuit, exposed a $40 million fraud, and was now untangling a betrayal that struck at the heart of the company her father built. She did all of it in just 72 hours. She thought of her father, his hand on her shoulder, telling her that the only code that truly lasts is the part nobody ever sees. She always thought he meant the elegant, complex back end of their programs. She understood now he was talking about character, about who you are when the servers are down and you have nowhere to hide, and the easy way out is to become smaller than you are. She hadn't become smaller. Not in her marriage, not in all the years she stayed quiet while David took credit for her algorithms. She had not shrunk. She had been learning, biding her time. She was becoming the woman this exact moment needed. At 12:30, Sarah called back. "I just got off with the FBI's cybercrime division," she said. "I spoke to a special agent named Cade. He was already very familiar with Apex dynamics from another investigation. I couldn't get specifics, but he wants a meeting this afternoon. 4 o'clock. He's coming to our office." "Good," Amelia said. "Amelia, I need to warn you about something." Sarah's voice changed. Taking on that tone, Amelia knew meant bad news was on the way. Agent Cade mentioned their file on Apex includes financial forensics. He didn't give me details, but he implied one of the main accounts they're watching is held by the Vance Family Trust. Amelia took a deep breath. "Eleanor, that's how I read it," Sarah said. "I could be wrong. It could be David. It could be nothing." "It's not nothing," Amelia said, and the certainty in her voice was colder than ice. It wasn't shock. It was the sound of the last horrible piece of the puzzle, locking into place, a suspicion she'd been pushing down for years, finally becoming real. So Eleanor Vance wasn't just the snide mother-in-law with a wine glass, mocking Amelia's every move. She wasn't just trying to sideline Amelia from the family business. Eleanor was part of it. She knew about Apex. She knew about the shell companies. She was helping her son bleed his own company dry while trying to destroy Amelia's credibility, all while calling her some naive girl playing CEO. "Tell Agent Cade," Amelia said, "that I'll be ready at 4 and that Leo will join me. He'll have our total cooperation." She paused. "And tell him I have another name I want to add to his list besides David and Marcus." Sarah knew not to ask. "I'll let him know," she said. The afternoon became a blur, the way time warps when a crisis reaches its breaking point. Amelia worked with Sarah's team, packaging the digital evidence into a crystal-clear narrative for the feds, every transaction time-stamped, and every claim backed by rock-solid proof. She worked with the intense focus of someone who knows the difference between justice and a cover-up often comes down to the quality of your evidence. At 2 o'clock, her assistant buzzed the intercom. "Miss Vance?" Her voice was cautious. "There's a woman here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent. Her name is Chloe." Amelia finished for her. Her assistant paused. "Yes." Amelia thought for a second. 3 days ago, she'd seen this woman's photo on David's laptop. 3 days wasn't long, but it had taught her the difference between the people who choose to betray you and the ones they just use along the way. "Send her in," Amelia said. "Use the small meeting room by the lobby." Chloe arrived looking like someone who'd been forced to make a dozen terrible choices in a row, and still had more to go. She sat across from Amelia, her hands clasped on the table so hard her knuckles were white. "I saw the press release online," Chloe said softly. "I saw it too," Amelia replied. "I wanted you to know I've already met with my own lawyer." She looked Amelia straight in the eye, and Amelia saw a spark of real strength, the kind that belongs to a woman who knows she's been played and chooses to face it head on. "I told her everything, the payments, the phone call from David, all of it. My lawyer is preparing a full statement for the authorities." She paused. I won't protect him. Whatever this is, I refuse to be that woman. Amelia just watched her. She imagined being 26, pregnant, and finding out the man you thought you were building a future with was just using you as a convenient alibi. "How are you?" Amelia asked, and she truly meant it. In the middle of all this chaos, the question was simple. Chloe's composure seemed to crack at the expected kindness. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm just trying to get through the next hour." Amelia nodded. "Your baby has nothing to do with any of this," she said. "Whatever happens to David, that child is innocent. I want you to know I will make sure any money recovered from this fraud won't touch his support obligations to you." She watched Chloe's expression. "You should have your attorney expect that." Chloe just stared back, completely floored. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Amelia said plainly, "and because I have no interest in punishing the people who got caught in the crossfire." After Chloe left, Amelia sat alone in the stark, glass-walled office. She thought about the other women this disaster could have turned her into, the one who would have demanded public humiliation, the one who would have crumbled under the weight of his betrayal and 7 years of being made to feel small, the version who might have taken a settlement and simply disappeared. But none of those women were here today. The agent, Mr. Cade, arrived at 4 o'clock sharp, and he was precisely the man she needed, calm, methodical, with the quiet focus of someone who finds ghosts in the machine for a living. He came with a young forensic analyst, took the water Amelia offered without breaking eye contact, and watched her with an intensity that took in far more than it revealed. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I need complete transparency." "You will have it," Amelia replied, "everything, with nothing held back." The meeting lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. Amelia answered every single question. She gave them access to every server. She told the story of the stolen algorithm without emotion, not trying to play the victim. And when Katie's questions turned personal about the marriage, when she first suspected her code was stolen, about that Tuesday morning, she answered with the same brutal honesty. The truth was all she had left. A truth, whether it was about stolen code or a broken life. At one point, Cade stopped typing and looked directly at her. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "let's walk through this timeline. You suspected your core algorithm was stolen 3 years ago." "Yes, and you took no legal action then." "No." Why not? It was the question she had been waiting for, the one she'd asked herself 1,000 times. "Because I was still his wife," she said. "Trying to fight him from inside his world, where my credibility was tied to his name, would have been suicide. I would have been labelled a crazy, jealous wife." She breathed in. "I waited until I was completely free of him, until the power was finally mine, not his." Cade studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "That's a remarkable amount of patience," he remarked. "It's a remarkable amount of faith," Amelia corrected him, "that the perfect moment will arrive if you're willing to build it yourself." The investigation moved like lightning after that. It happens fast when the data is clean and the source code tells the whole story, especially when your target has been on a venture capital watch list for 8 months. That was the last piece Cade shared. Julian Vance was already under investigation for investor fraud, and Amelia's proof had just connected 2 cases. 2 separate investigations that were unknowingly chasing the exact same lie. The next morning, Mark Renshaw, the CTO, was put on administrative leave from Vance Innovations. Amelia did it herself. She called him to her new office at 8:15 a.m. and laid out precisely what was coming. She watched his expression move through the predictable stages of a man caught first denial, then a frantic scramble to spin a new story, and finally a quiet, crushing defeat when he saw the evidence was airtight. "I needed the stock options," he finally whispered, his voice stripped of all its usual tech bro confidence. "My daughter's college tuition. I made a choice I can never take back." Amelia just looked at him. She offered no pity, but she offered no scorn either. She had learned a vital lesson this week about the line between justice and revenge, and she refused to cross it. Your cooperation with the board's internal investigation is the only thing that will decide what happens to you, she told him. I suggest you call a lawyer this morning. She stood. He left. She fell back into her chair, feeling an exhaustion so profound it had nothing to do with sleep but with years of living on high alert. She was tired in a way that sleep could never fix. But buried beneath that weariness was something new, something that felt very much like freedom. Chloe Dalton, the venture capitalist, was deposed by Amelia S. lawyers on a Thursday, just 12 days after Amelia walked out of that glass house for good. The deposition was sealed, but news still rippled through Silicon Valley. It always does. Amelia heard about it from her lawyer, Diana, who simply said the secession had been productive and that new inquiries were being opened into market manipulation. 3 weeks later, Julian Vance accepted a huge settlement to avoid a public trial. The details weren't public, but Diana outlined them for Amelia over the phone with her usual calm. A full admission of stealing the algorithm's origin, complete financial restitution, total cooperation with the SEC's investigation, and a 7-year ban from being CEO of any public company. Amelia absorbed every word. When Diana was done, there was silence. The algorithm, she asked, is it mine again? Effective as of the signing, Diana confirmed. Every single line of code. Full ownership, plus damages based on the revenue it generated. She paused. Amelia, this settlement is a life-changing number. I know, Amelia said. Transfer the damages to the new trust. I want to discuss this charter next week. For years, she had known what she would do with the money. She'd known since that morning she packed her laptop and left, thinking of all the brilliant women who couldn't leave. The ones with no buyout, no sparkling new office waiting for them. The women trapped in meetings, told their ideas weren't good enough, their work erased, their silence bought by the threat of being called difficult. The Vance Initiative launched its first incubator 4 months after the settlement. It was a startup accelerator, a mentorship network, and a legal defense fund run by people who knew that surviving the boys' club is not the same as healing from it. And it was funded entirely by the damages from the Vance IP settlement. Amelia was at the launch party. She stood at the entrance, shaking hands with the first class of founders, accepting their thanks. She'd been through too much for false modesty. She earned this moment. She built this, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. David stood beside her, a constant, quiet presence. At one point, he leaned in and murmured, "Your father would be proud." "I know," she whispered back, feeling it in her bones. It was a strange comfort, the presence of someone long gone, whose strength was now so completely woven into her own spirit. Liam was transferred to a federal prison on a grey Wednesday morning. Amelia ignored the news alerts. She'd already processed his downfall. She had no interest in the public spectacle. She took the call from her sister Chloe, said almost nothing, and went to her next meeting. Sophia Dubois was never criminally charged. There was proof she knew about Liam's scheme, but not enough for a conspiracy charge, a legal loophole that infuriated Chloe far more than Amelia. But Sophia faced another kind of justice. Civil suits went after her family's assets with surgical precision, dismantling the Dubois fortune piece by piece. The socialite status she had spent her life building simply vanished into dust. Amelia heard the updates from her lawyers, who were tracking it all. She took it in with that same unnerving calm. It wasn't victory. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something deeper, a quiet feeling of order, finally being restored. It felt like a world finally right side up, after being upside down for so long you forgot what gravity was. 6 months after it began, Amelia arrived at Vance Industries just after 7. She took the private elevator to the top floor, got her coffee from David, and sat behind the desk that was her father's, and was now hers. She opened the first encrypted file. On her desk sat a single frame she'd put there herself, the only personal item in the room. It wasn't the old photo of her parents laughing in the garden, the one she'd quietly placed in a drawer. That old photo was still in the drawer. It was history, And Amelia Vance didn't erase history. The picture in the frame was new. It showed her, alone, standing at the massive window of this office, her back to the camera, looking down at the city below. David had taken it on her first day back and just left the print on her desk. She knew exactly what it meant. It was a portrait of a woman who knew exactly where she was. At the head of a tech empire she built, a survivor of an investigation, with a foundation in her father's name and a company that would outlast the man who tried to steal it. A man who never understood what. For 7 years, Clara Hayes let her husband's family make her feel like nothing. They needed her to be small so they could feel big. And she played the part perfectly, taking the quiet insults with a patient smile, letting them think she was defeated right up until she wasn't. She hadn't been shrinking, she was collecting proof. And when she finally made her move, their perfect world fell apart. Clara swiped to the next photo on his phone, because this was the real her, the woman he tried to bury, and no one was ever going to make her forget that again.